This is Paul Pearson, host of Star Time. And when I'm not meeting Mrs. Jones in that cafe for a chat and nothing else, I'm listening to rainieravenueradio.world.
All of us have struggled through the COVID-19 pandemic, and many of our communities have been particularly hard hit. Some things definitely need to change, but a few things should stay the same, like protecting your child from serious diseases you can prevent now. Preventable diseases like measles, mumps, and whooping cough. Is camp, childcare, or in-person school on your family's agenda? Give your child a healthy and safe summer and school year by making sure they're up to date on vaccinations and well child visits. You have the power to protect. Call your healthcare provider to find out what vaccinations your child is due for and make an appointment today. If you need help finding a provider, visit parenthelp123.org or call the Help Me Grow Washington hotline at 1-800-322-2588. An interpretation is available.
Women Empowerment Talk Radio, your roadmap to business success. Tune in every Sunday at 3 p.m. on rainieravenueradio.world, providing resources and sharing motivational experiences from the everyday entrepreneur. Tune in Women Empowerment Talk Radio every Sunday, 3 p.m. on rainieravenueradio.world.
This is Big Poppy, host of Jazz from the Cabinets. Join me each week for a listening tour of the first century of jazz, an eclectic mix of Dixieland, big band, cool jazz, bebop, contemporary jazz, world jazz, all jazz in all forms. That's Jazz from the Cabinets with Big Poppy on Rainier Avenue Radio, streaming worldwide on rainieravenueradio.world.
If you or a family member are 55 or over and need nursing home level
Some of the questions are,
want to keep living where you are, check out Providence Elder Place PACE. This program offers healthcare, housing, transportation, and recreational activities. There are no co-pays or deductibles, and it's covered through Medicare and Medicaid. Providence Elder Place PACE works to keep healthy and in your home. Call 206-320-5325 or visit providence.org Elder Place. Providence.org Elder Place.
Mm-hmm.
You are listening to rainieravenueradio.world. Don't forget to log on www.rainieravenueradio.world. 5, 4, 3, 2.
Radio. It is your host, Queen Bree, and I am welcoming you into our month-long celebration of Black History. Tonight, we will be talking about being an immigrant in Black America. Today, we have Dr. Shukri Olow and Mulki Mohamad, and we're gonna join them in a discussion of being an African immigrant in America. Welcome, ladies.
Thank you so much, Queen Bree. Thank you to the folks at Rainier Avenue Radio and Tony and the team. We are live in Columbia City Theater, which is actually, I think, my first time here. And so super excited to be here, super excited for this conversation during Black History Month, and honored to be sharing in this conversation with Mulki Mohamad, who I've had the pleasure of knowing over the last year. Mulki, tell us a bit more about yourself.
Thank you, Shukri, for the perfect introduction. I'll make sure I'm close to the mic because I'm a little short. But my name is Mulki Mohamad, and a little bit about myself. Probably start off with like just birth and journey to America. I was born in Nairobi, Kenya, in 1995, September. But and when I was there, my parents are from Somalia, and in the 90s there was a civil war. The early 90s, so they had to relocate from Somalia to Kenya, where my older brother was born and me. And by 1996, we came over to America. We immigrated here. And so I just kind of grew up, I guess, in the American way since, I guess, sorry, I don't mean to use that word too much. But ever since then, I just been learning more about my identity, learning what it means to be American, what it means to be a Somali American, what it means to be Black American, and all that in the same sense, because it's a lot of intersectionalities and everything. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. And I loved how you pointed out the multiple sort of identities that you hold, and being not only as a refugee, as a Black woman, as a young Black woman, as a Black Muslim woman,
Yes.
and that intersection. Do you tell me more about that intersection? What does that feel like, especially here in America?
So it's a lot of, especially in different timings. I feel like growing up in, so I was born in 1995, and I guess by the time I really got to be more aware of what's going on was probably in the 2000s early. And there was that big experience of like the 9/11 and things like that kind of showed me what it means to be Muslim. Like, obviously, I see my mom wearing the scarf, I see my dad pray, and I would know the religion through that sense, but I didn't realize what it meant in like a worldwide view so early on, especially around 6. So I was kind of like getting more, that's why I really honed in on that identity. But even then, around that time in 2001 is when I went into school. So I was starting kindergarten and learning about what it means to be Black in terms of being immigrant and like Black American, the differences between that. Really didn't realize it at first. I remember there was an event for Martin Luther King Day, and it was interesting. They did this experiment where they told some parents to bring kids in normal clothes because they went to a school that was uniform. So they did this experiment where they treated the kids in normal clothes very good, and then the kids in uniform got like very, I guess, extreme treatment, which was teaching us about segregation and everything like that. And I was like, okay, wow, I didn't realize there was this history. And then that's where I got to like realize more of the racial awakening in America, especially still, I was young and very like in my world, but that was my first time knowing the intersectionalities of being African, African American, and Black, and like the differences or similarities in one.
Beautiful. I'm happy to share my journey. I think it's also similar to Mulki. I am a Somali immigrant. I was born in the capital. I'm not going to tell you when because I don't want to age myself on Rainier Avenue Radio here. But I was born in the capital, and in 1991, that's actually how many of us were able to resettle to the U.S. and to different countries abroad. There was a civil war in my birth country, which led to millions of us fleeing the conflict. We were able to get to the refugee camps of Kenya and sought refuge there. My family spent about 6 years in the camps, along with hundreds of thousands of other Somalis who fled the conflict. And we were able to get our lottery numbers sort of rise to the top of the waiting list because my younger sister needed to have urgent heart surgery after 6 years. And so we were told that we're going to America with no historical context about what that meant, literally airdropped in the middle of Texas in 1996. And I remember some of the comments that young people, children used to say in the camps about the US, that there was money growing from the trees and, that we were going to, the land of opportunity and not really knowing what that meant. And I vividly recall just landing in Texas and looking for trees and money. I had no concept of what money was because we didn't have access to it in the camps. But I remember feeling like I was lied to and wanting to go back to the camps. Texas was a very strange place. I think, you can just try to close your eyes and imagine, coming to a new country, not speaking the language at that time. It was just my mother, who was a widow at that point with 3 children by herself in a new country, didn't speak the language, didn't have any social networks, didn't know anybody, didn't have a job or prior education, and was told to figure things out. And after 9 months, your refugee benefits run out. And so we also didn't have any knowledge about the history of this country. We came and were told that we, are immigrants. We are ethnically Somali. We are different from, native-born African Americans, and that we had all the opportunities that we could take advantage of in this country. And I remember, the first interaction that I had with an African American child, just going up to her and, starting a conversation in Somali and being confused because she wouldn't respond back to me. I thought everybody was Somali who was Black. And, I was like, what's happening? Why, in Somali, like, like asking her, like, why are you not talking to me? Like, is there something on my face? Like, what's wrong? And then quickly realizing that, that there was a language barrier, and often being told by white educators that, that we're different. And so we ended up moving from Texas because we felt, in hindsight, we're able to name that experience, that of racism. Yeah. But in that moment, we would get all kinds of looks and people would treat us differently, and often in really unkind ways. And we ended up moving to Washington because I think my mother just didn't feel safe. Mulki mentioned the experience of 9/11. I think that is when I had my awakening in this country as a young person. I was about 15 years old, and that moment happened, and I vividly recall just experiencing sort of an identity crisis. I actually, to that point, have been here like 5 years, learned the language. I didn't really know who I was, and often was being told who I was, that I was Somali, that I was ethnically, Somali, and no concept of racial identity, no concept of religious identity up until that point, until 9/11 happened. And I think that was the awakening that many of us young people had, this feeling of some people who identify the same way did something, and now we're all under this microscope and we're being held to account for something that we didn't even do. I actually remember one of my teachers asking me, Shukri, what are your people doing? And I was like, who are my people? Yeah. And I didn't even know who my people were. And so that was actually the first time in my life where I was able to connect with a Black woman who worked at the rec hall that I grew up in this public housing complex in the city of Kent, and asking her, my teacher said this to me today, who are my people? And actually, she, gave me so many books on, Black history, and led me to the works of Angela Davis and Audre Lorde, and just incredible Black scholars. And that's when I finally realized that there's a complex and complicated history in this nation. And as immigrants, I think we have an obligation to learn about this, not just Black struggle, Black enslavement, but also about Black resistance and Black resilience and Black liberation. And so that I've been sort of on that journey, trying to deconstruct and unpack the things that I've been taught and conditioned to believe in about African Americans. And because white supremacy isn't just happening, in systems, right? It's not just about something that white people do. It's also embedded and indoctrinated in the immigrant experience. And so I don't know if you experienced some of that, Mulki, where you were told, we're kind of different generations. I'm older than you, but I don't know if you were told that you're different. You're not like those people. Did you get some of those messages?
Oh, to like differentiate between in like a religious sense?
In a religious sense, but also like in an ethnic, racial sense.
Oh, I definitely, because obviously I feel like that goes into like tokenism and like being that only one person in the room. I think sometimes the media, because you know how you say when you're immigrating to America, you think about the American dream, the white picket fence, and like how much you could come here, grow, and like build. So I think when I was young, I would see that in the media, see like infomercials back home to Africa, like, oh, you can feed this starving kid for 35 cents a day. So I would be so in shock, like, wow, this is what my parents kind of like saved me from, and I'm in here in America. I kind of, I guess in a weird way, viewed it as like I had an opportunity to do better, or do, I don't know, to make my time here different. But then I would be in like honor classes and different things like that in school, where I think that it does come in with the tokenism, where they will be like, oh, like, look at you, you're succeeding, you're doing so much money, like, wow, you're from in low income background, but you're in this honor class, like, look at the opportunity you have. And I guess that kind of makes it seem like, why else isn't there more people in here that look like me? And I do think it's more about resources not being applied well, or not being applied to the people in need, like the people that really need it. And I feel like I was more independent, and that's probably why I got myself in those areas of like schooling in different areas. But I guess I didn't feel like I was different from whatever the media or perception was, I kind of looked at, if that's what they're saying, it applies to all of us. It wouldn't just be like, oh, you're different from whatever people are saying. I kind of looked at like, oh no, that does apply to me because that still is my identity and you can't really take it away. Like I can't take away being Black from being a woman and being Muslim. I feel like all of that kind of applies. So if someone would be like, oh, this is how I view this group, however, you're different, I wouldn't view it like, I still think that's how they view me. They're just not saying it.
Yeah,
So, yeah.
that's such a good point. And a problematic way of people kind of wanting to put you in a box.
Exactly,
Based
yeah.
on one aspect of your identity. And you're not just one aspect, you are a whole person.
Yes.
Right? You come as a whole person. I'm curious because you mentioned the media, and there's a question about how the media's negative images of Black communities has shaped how some Black immigrants perceive, the Black American experience. Do you recall any experience with the media and maybe how it perceives either African Americans or Black immigrants?
I guess Black immigrants, it did have a big impact on me on the media because I didn't have that connection to life back home before I came here. So I really didn't know or could have anything that could, have a creation in my mind. So whatever I seen on the media was what I thought was true. And especially in like the early 2000s, there wasn't too much, like you can't just log on and just, research. I guess you could Google, but I was too young to really have that that opportunity. Right. So I just seen whatever's on the commercial and I would just think like, oh, wow, why is Africa so poor? It's a big country. There's so much resources. I would think like, why are these countries, especially Somalia, you know how our country didn't have a government for a long time. There's a civil war. I was like, why is that? Like, why is it so, I guess in that place, but I think it was the media feeding a lot of lies. And when you can't really go research, you just have to take the information you get from face value. But for the perception, I think, of media on Black Americans, it would be a lot of from movies or other maybe news cycles. They would try to make it seem as if there was a lot of violence in communities. I grew up in a low-income community, so I feel like back then they made it seem as if like neighborhoods would just be like violent places where people would sell drugs and like they would, you couldn't walk without getting, I guess, hurt. But then that's not true to me because I grew up here and I'll be like, oh, this is a pretty safe area, things like that where I can really fight against it. So I feel like the media didn't ruin my perception of like Black Americanness, but more so for back home because I couldn't really verify that news. So I just took it for face value in my sense. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point. We didn't have access to the media back home. But when we do come here, and as immigrants in particular, Black East African immigrants in the late 90s, we didn't have access to television. But once we did, the only thing that we saw in the news was just negative stereotypes about Black people, right? It was about the guns and the drugs and people in poverty. And, as a Black immigrant or as an immigrant more broadly, you're wondering, like, how does that happen and what's happening here? And if you don't have the historical context, if you don't have that grounding in the history of this nation, you begin to sort of believe the things that you're watching, right?
Yeah.
That an entire group of people are this way until you understand the history of enslavement, until you understand, policies like redlining, until you understand the war on drugs and how Black people have been segregated in these really poor communities, until you understand the way that white supremacy has moved in the Black community, you don't really see that big picture, right?
Yeah.
And that's been my experience as an immigrant, and just being curious as a young person about, well, why is this, right? Why is there high poverty in these communities? Why are guns rampant? Why are why don't folks have access to housing or to a decent education or a better quality of life? And the why, right, is white supremacy. And
Exactly.
For many of us as immigrants, we don't have that historical context. We don't often chase that either because we're so we're trying to rebuild our lives. We have unpacked traumas. Many of us fled our countries as victims of war. We're trying to sort of restart our lives, and often I think also chase that American dream that we've been conditioned to believe in. We're building our houses with the white picket fence. We're
Yeah.
trying to raise our kids until, especially those of us who have proximity to Blackness, until we're impacted by the systems of oppression. And I want to actually, it's not one of the questions, but I'm curious about your thoughts, Mulki,
Yeah.
on the events of, the racial reckoning that happened 2 years ago in this country with the murder of George Floyd. Do you think that there was an awakening also happening in our communities?
Yes, or like the Somali
In
community.
the Somali community in
Yes,
particular?
I definitely think so. For me, I feel like I was so growing up. I have to like my experience with the police, not personally, but like my perception of them has changed greatly, I guess. Because as a kid, I grew up in Yesler Community Center, or like it was a big project for low income housing, right?
Yes, sir, Terrace,
And
yeah.
that was it's just a lot of communities are there. There's African immigrants, there's Black Americans, Asian people, and just very diverse background, right? So the police would be very like it was a presence there, and as a kid I would just be like, oh, the police is here. I would have a great happy experience because they would be around the kids. They'll give us free like stickers. So it was different then. But growing up and just seeing things like my experience was probably like in the late 2000s, Oscar Grant, seeing that, and then Trayvon Martin, 2012, and Mike Brown. So for me, I've always kind of like seen, had that awakening before George Floyd, I guess. But in the Somali community, I do think I have seen it getting greater and greater, especially with people having a more developed sense of like awareness of being Black, being Somali, and like knowing the how it goes together. Because I feel like a long time, because being in Africa, you don't really notice your Black identity or your race aspect, especially when you're just around people with the same ethnic background. You will just go into like different categories. But coming to America, you would like have to be aware of your race because it plays a different factor here. So I think maybe that moment maybe rehoned the idea of like, oh yeah, we are Black, we are Black as a race. This is the treatment that might be applied to. Because at first I feel like maybe it was a more an individual aspect, like, oh, I'm Somali and I'm just a Somali individual. But you have your ethnicity, your nationality, and your race, and they all kind of coincide. So I feel like that's probably the best thing, or thing that came out from that moment, was just like a greater sense of identity.
Yeah. I love your point about this awakening happening, even prior to George Floyd and the murder of George Floyd. I mean, Black people have been talking about, violence on Black bodies for decades and centuries, right? But for us, I think what I have noticed, especially in the last 2 years, and not just with the murder of George Floyd, but a murder of Somali young people in the state of Minnesota, for example, and the murder of Jalal Eid, there is this new kind of awareness within our communities that, violence, and particularly police violence, isn't just impacting, Black Americans, right? Or African Americans, that this is something that's happening to us too, because we have a case here, another case here, another case here. There's a pattern that's being developed in our communities, and people are beginning to see that this is something that could also happen to them. But I also want to acknowledge that there are people within our communities who've been on the right side of justice, right, for a very long time. I mean, there are pictures that when I was doing my research a few years back on Somali women, and just the badassness of Somali women. Like, I remember seeing a picture of Somali women protesting in 1972 for the release of Angela Davis, and those are the things that people don't know, right? Even though we're not race conscious in our birth countries, there isn't this sense that you are Black, right? Because everyone is like you. You don't constantly feel hyper visible of your identity. But we do acknowledge injustice when it's happening abroad, and we see that. And the intersection of our faith tradition too. Regardless of where injustice is happening, you're supposed to call that out, right? You're supposed to do something about it. There's a saying of the Prophet, where he says, call it out with your tongue, or if you can't, then hate it in your heart, right? And so I feel that there's a reawakening in our communities, but so much more work that needs to happen for sure. Do you think that within the broader East African community that some of that work is happening too, or even within young people?
Definitely within the pandemic, I could definitely see more work within the community. I feel like people are becoming more aware of like activism and how different ways they can get involved, especially within local government or like their experience here. I would see, I think from the George Floyd experience, moment, it happened. After that, I would see a lot of posts on Instagram, informational ones, people posting things on their stories, events to get together and like fund money to send back home or to send it to the different organizations. And I'll see a lot between the Somali community, Eritreans, and Ethiopians with different actions that have happened within the past 2 years, especially political movements that have arisen. And I think it's like great to see more people get involved within activism, because it's always good to kind of like see, like if you see an injustice or you see something that can be improved, to work with the people mobilized and to kind of like find a way to different solutions or find a way to solve it if there is a solution. Yeah.
Awesome. I want to shift next to maybe that generational divide in our communities.
Yeah.
You're younger than I am. I've been on this journey now for a little over 17 years. How I understand race relations in this country is much more different than, an aunt of mine or my own mother, for example. How do you think we should sort of bridge these kinds of conversations in our own communities, maybe in our own families, right? Where there might be not this level of awareness.
I definitely think it's good to spark up a conversation, especially when you're like, say if you're watching the news and you see a story about like an incident, you can just probably be like, oh, what do you think about this? And bring that up to the elders in your family and to see if there's like their viewpoint. I remember I was talking to my mom about the George Floyd case, and she was just like, wow, that's like very crazy. Not crazy, but like it's just very overwhelming. And she had a lot of input that I just would have been surprised about her, I guess, awareness of racial identity. And she was like, yeah, well, she's like, that's how we've been treated throughout the time here, because they've been here longer, my parents, and they had to go through the process of like immigrating here. So I think they probably had a different view of like what America was and then what it is now that they've been here for 20 years plus. So I think for her to see that, I was like, oh, wow, like the people are getting it. They're getting more aware. And I think if we just have more conversations, maybe even have events where we can have generational, like a panel with young people and older people, and to figure out their ideas and have discussions, that could probably do a lot in the community.
Yeah, I remember trying to begin that conversation with my own family members and older aunts of mine, and it's always an aunt for some reason.
Yeah.
I don't know. I find it easier to have that conversation with an aunt than an uncle. But yeah, there was a spectrum of awareness, right? There are some people who, would say, this, what you're talking about, Shukri, doesn't exist, right? I mean, this person probably did something to cause their murder, for example. And then the other side is that, there's definitely something happening here, and it's very concerning, and we should be part of the effort to put an end to it, right? And I don't know how to sort of bridge that spectrum, but I know that at least we're having the conversations in our communities, which is incredibly critical and timely.
Yes.
I think we're going to be on a short break. We will be back for more.
Definitely stay tuned.
Here with the Rainier Avenue Radio Traffic Update. You can listen to us in your car 24/7 anytime by downloading the free TuneIn app. Once you do, search Rainier Avenue Radio. And remember, do not curse out your fellow drivers. This has been your Rainier Avenue Radio Traffic Update.
My name is Keith. I'm a barber from Tacoma, Washington. When the pandemic hit, it did affect me as a business owner. I had my own personal reasons why I didn't get vaccinated. But I was talking to a doctor, and he was telling me more about what it could do to protect us and our family. I wanted to get back to that. Once was, right? I do feel safe knowing that I am vaccinated. I just hope what I'm saying is reaching into people's heads to know that this is the best decision for all of us. To learn more, please visit hereforuswa.org.
Hello, listener. What's important to you about what's going on in your community? Are you interested? Are you concerned? In any case, I invite you to tune into my show, Seattle Here and Now, on rainieravenueradio.world. Why? I will be covering a wide range of topics important to you and impacting the community. Each show will have a special guest or guests to share with you information on a variety of subjects that are happening here and now in Seattle. I promise I will work hard to make my show informative, interesting, and entertaining. Be sure to listen to Seattle Here and Now on Rain.
Lovers, check out the Quiet Storm Dedication Show with Sergio LaCour on Love Lines. Thursdays, 9 p.m. Pacific on rainieravenueradio.world.
I love the music.
Wash your hands, don't touch your face, wipe things down, clean up your space. When you cough and sneeze, do responsibly. If you feel you're getting ill, isolate at home and chill. No, you're not alone. Please pick up your phone and call 206-477-3977. King County 206-477-3977. Public Health 206-477-3977. King County 206-477-3977. Public Community Radio Station will provide you with more information. Say Rainier Avenue Radio. Your community radio station will provide you with more information. Rainier Avenue Radio.
You know you can't get enough of Rainier Avenue Radio.world.
And what it's like to be a Black immigrant coming to this country, and some of the things that we had gone through, and the interactions that we've had with people, and our ability to understand our history and our place really in this country. I want to go back to something that we sort of addressed at the surface level earlier, Mulki, which is this idea of stereotypes, right? The stereotypes that we often saw in the media. The perception that, there's a lot of violence in the Black community, and many of the negative images that we were seeing about the Black experience. And do you think that sort of exists also within the African community?
Yeah.
Does that stereotype sort of go both ways?
I feel like it definitely goes both ways. With the experience of growing up, I think with media is seeing how it applies with children, especially with like certain movies about, I guess, focus on Africa, would probably have a perception where it could be, what was I going to think about? Like Coming to America, I guess, was like kind of like a take on like how Africa would be. But then it's not all royalty or like having maids and things like that. I guess it could be like a subsection or something like that. But that would give, I guess, a perception to people like, oh, maybe this is what it means to be African. However, this is just probably one aspect of it, because there's 54 countries. So there's like tons of different ways you can present your African identity. However, I also noticed, I think like as the kids growing up, people would be like, oh, can you talk in tongues? Because there is like certain dialect that has more of that aspect in their language. But I feel like that was probably one generalization that I would be like surprised at. I'd be like, no, what is like the clicking sound or something? And I'd be like, no, I talk more English. I think I talk this language better than my own, to be honest. And then that was like it's interesting to see how it was applied. And I guess, you know, the terms African booty scratcher, different things like that, what it means. And I didn't realize where that came from until I later watched, I think, Boys in the Hood, and then it had like one aspect in there. So I was like, was this where it came from, this media, or like was it a different term? So that's the ways I see it apply in movies. Infomercials would have like the feed this kid, and then you would think everywhere is poor in Africa. But when I talked to my mom, she was like, no, it was amazing. Like, she was like, if I could go back home to Somalia, how it was in like the 80s, she would. So I didn't realize, I guess, the perception, how much it got to me until I talked to her. But it took me to reach out to kind of ask the questions, to see a different perceptions, to see a different reality, things like that.
Beautiful. Yeah, similar experience as Mulki mentioned. The stereotypes were pretty sort of visible, you know, in the media, you know, of both ways, right? Like when we came here, we were seeing Black people in poorer communities and lots of crime, lots of violence, lots of poverty. And I think there was this belief that many Black communities were sort of this way because of what we were seeing. And sometimes, you know, you would have an experience or two that sort of affirms what you just saw on the news.
Yeah.
And vice versa for some Black Americans. I'm sure there were, you know, the commercials of feed this child for $1 a day. And you see that, you know, or another war broke out in Burkina Faso or in Somalia. And you're thinking, you know, the entire continent is rigged with violence and poverty, when that's not the case. I think when you sort of unpack the surface and begin to understand that we have so much more in common than not.
Exactly.
we have an entire shared history, that there are 54 nations in the African continent with incredible history and diversity, and ethnic backgrounds and religious identity, and so much depth, and, you know, former dynasties that were whose resources were depleted by colonialism and white supremacy, and that, you know, it isn't the people's fault, right? People just don't end up in that way, and the same thing here, that, you know, people don't end up in these conditions, right? There are policies that made it possible for people to be in these sorts of communities, that policies that kept people displaced, right? And literally it kept them in those sorts of conditions. And so when you begin to sort of peel and look beyond the surface, you understand what's happening, and you are able to check what you've been conditioned to believe, and your biases that you hold, right? And of course, you know, as human beings, we all hold biases, about
unconscious ones,
unconscious, conscious. And it's so important that we begin to acknowledge when it is happening. Question for you, Mulki. Do you think that we're getting better in like seeking out that history as Black immigrants?
Oh, like seeking out the history of African history or Black American?
The African American history in this country.
For sure. I think, especially growing up, I would learn more about like Martin Luther King Day when I mentioned that event or that experience at school. That's when I first learned about segregation. So I would then kind of see more documentaries or things about like what the experience was like in America. Obviously learning about slavery in the Jim Crow era and just kind of like the whole history of Black people in America taught me a lot. And I kind of viewed it in the sense of like being thankful for what people did here to kind of make the whole diaspora have an easier experience, because it was a lot of fighting to get rights, to get to be viewed as human, you know? So if that wasn't happening, I don't think like African immigrants probably would have been able to immigrate here if there wasn't the civil rights era. Maybe possibly, but it would have been a harder experience, you know? So I've always viewed it in that sense of like working together. We're all part of one entire Black experience. And then learning about the history would show me like when slavery happened, colonization happened as well, and just kind of learning about how once like how Africa being ravaged and being depleted of its resources, how it's kind of connected with everything overall. So I think that's something that came to me more when I was learning about history of Black American history and how it kind of ties back home. especially when there's Black civil rights leaders that were Pan-African. You would see that, and then learning about like Patrice Lumumba and everything back home. I would just be like, wow, like we were even having our own civil rights movements, which is really cool. So it's like cool to see how it intertwines together.
Yeah, during the civil rights movement in this country, many African nations were also gaining their independence. You mentioned Patrice Lumumba, Thomas Sankara, and we had Malcolm X here in this country.
Yeah.
And you're right, it was because of the civil rights movement that we are here as immigrants, literally, not just Black immigrants, but all immigrants, because Black people who were fighting for Black liberation also said, those people over there need freedom. They too deserve freedom. They too deserve to be in a safe nation, right? They weren't just fighting for Black liberation here. They were fighting for the liberation of all people, including us. And I think it's important to understand that as immigrants, but especially as Black immigrants, that because of the work that Black people did, we have so much like benefited from that. We came to this country, and there's, thank goodness, opportunities for some of us, not all, right? Some of us are able to build homes and, start businesses and, get an education and pursue a doctorate like I did and run for office like I did, right? But that doesn't happen without a struggle. Like people died for that, right? Black people died for our right to be here. And that's such a, sorry.
It's very emotional though. Like when I would think about it, I would be like, wow, if that didn't happen. And it kind of makes me kind of like super surprised that there is that media perception that there's like Africans versus African Americans, because I don't think it should be that way. I feel like especially just Black people in the diaspora, whether it's like the Caribbeans, America, Africa, like we're all super connected, especially in that history of how our identities are set up and how like even within the African continent, how borders were set up for us by other colonial powers. So I think it's just very like intertwined, but it's very emotional.
Yeah. And I didn't mean to get emotional, but they're just thinking about people who loved on us without even knowing us, people who saw our humanity without even seeing us, I think just makes me feel this huge burden to do my part, and so I'm curious about what you think, Mulki, what we can do as Black immigrants to do our part, to carry the torch that African Americans have shouldered often alone for centuries.
I think how we should do our part is to definitely get involved with activism more, organizing, just doing things that you feel like you can in your own respective power. I understand like not everybody could be like more active or be leaders, but you can do that in any sense you can, even through sharing information on your social media profiles or anything. I feel like being aware and being more connected could be one aspect. Another one could be through education. Learning more, taking classes. Through that, I learned a lot. I would connect with more people too of different backgrounds, more like Africans, Black Americans, everything. And being in clubs, that was probably the biggest for me. When I was in UW, my great experience was probably like being part of ASA, African Student Association, being a part of BSU, Black Student Union, and even when I was in the club, becoming like president and collabing with those different organizations like Black Student Union, and having meetings where we would talk about what does it mean to be African on campus or African American, and having that, especially with the younger generation, I feel like it makes us be more aware of our identity and how we can work together. So things like that, collaborating, discussing, learning more can do a lot.
Yeah, I love that. And the learning more about each other goes both ways, right?
Yes.
It's not just about, us learning about the history of this nation. And, often I think what we learn is about just MLK, right? But there's so much that happened prior to MLK. And there's so much more to enslavement, right? Black people just weren't enslaved. They also resisted. Like they fought and died because of that resistance. There's so much more that we can learn about the history of Black people in this country, but also, of Black people globally, right? Because racism, anti-Blackness isn't just something that's felt in this country. It's a global.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, it's been globalized.
Yeah, it's unfortunate for real.
I'm curious, maybe the last couple of questions
Yeah.
is around what is the African immigrant level of participation in and contribution to Black American activism? I see you as an activist, Mulki.
Yeah, I definitely feel like I am one, especially growing up. I would just try to be involved as much as I can. So I think at 14, I wanted a job, but I couldn't apply for one because I feel like you had to be 16 in Washington State. I'm not sure. But there was this program through Seattle Youth Employment Program, which I signed up for and then became involved in Seattle Young People's Project, which is another organization focused on activism. So once I got involved at that at 15, 14, I did kind of was more aware of what it meant. I definitely feel like I to be an activist. That's where I learned about Angela Davis more, and I actually was super excited that I got to I got to go to an event with Angela Davis there speaking. But I didn't really know too much about her history at the time, so I don't think I could have appreciated it as much as I was now. But I still took that opportunity through that program to do different events, be a facilitator, and just hone in my experience, which I think having things like that, especially as a young kid, can give you a lot of practice in the real world and how to like interact later on, because I feel like that encouraged me to then go on to clubs like African Student Association and apply for a president role. So all of that kind of helped me out, things to be more involved.
Yeah, and you're still doing a lot of that
Activism.
work.
Yes, even currently with working with my dad, he has a news organization called Renta News Media, and that's focused a lot on African news, but it's also focused on the Muslim community and even Black Americans in Seattle, like just all of us all together. And from that, there's a lot of things that I can see more activism in like local groups, and especially in the pandemic, a lot of Somali grocery stores would put together food boxes or kits to send out. So I feel like that's activism with the older generation more so. And things like that, I could see it a lot through working with my dad. So I think that's different ways that we can get involved as immigrants to be more aware, figure out how you can be an activist or an organizer in your role, in a sense, or like whatever your current field is. And you can be amazing to see everybody from different likes in different roles try to be activists and try to create a different road together.
Beautiful. Shout out to Mahmoud Yusuf. He is the editor of Renta News, Mulki's father, and one of the OG activists in the Somali community. Like, this man was reporting on like displacement before there was even a word in our language.
It's crazy, yeah.
Like a Bacaro displacement. And he's been here for a long time. How long has your family lived in Seattle?
We came here in 1996, but during like the time frame of like the war and everything, I know my dad was an active journalist in back home. So like in the 80s and like the early 90s, he would kind of document that, which I also think that's probably activism, to like kind of go out there when there's a war and try to like get information and disperse that. So that's really interesting.
Yeah, you have that already in your bloodline. I love it.
It's awesome.
I think happy to respond to this question. The African immigrant level of participation, I think it has evolved. The longer we are here in this country, most of us have been here under 25 years. The longer we are here, the more we understand about this complex and sort of complicated history.
Yeah.
The more we understand that our fates are intertwined and interconnected, the more we understand that we have an obligation to do our part because it's also impacting us. I think initially when many of us came here, we were thinking the civil war in Somalia was going to end at some point and we were going to make a few dollars maybe and then go back home.
Yeah.
There's this concept in many immigrant communities of having one foot in the country that is hosting you and the other foot in your birth country. And with the hope that, you can put both feet where your heart is, which is often where you were born, right? Where you are home or feel like you're home. And for many of us, we have not had that chance. to go back to our homes where it feels like it's safe
Yeah.
enough. I actually went back home to my birth country in 2017 for the first time since 1991.
That's good.
And it was a surreal experience. And, you know, the first time that I felt like I belonged in a space, you know, where everyone looked like you,
Yeah.
everyone spoke your language, you know, no one was looking at you because you looked different, right?
Yeah.
There wasn't this hyper focus on your identity because everyone was the same. And that actually reminds me of the opportunities for healing question, which is what are the opportunities for healing, reconciliation, and collaboration between African immigrants and native-born Black Americans? I would invite our brothers and sisters and siblings from the African American community to visit back home. I would invite you to take a trip to Ghana, to take a trip to Cameroon, to take a trip to Ethiopia or Somalia, South Africa,
yeah, lots of countries.
Mozambique, Burkina Faso,
Kenya.
Kenya,
That's a great
Egypt.
one.
You know, take a trip back home and experience that sense of belonging that I think many of us are longing for and seeking for, because that was the first time that I actually felt not judged.
I want to definitely have that experience because I was born in Nairobi, Kenya, but I haven't ever been to Somalia, and I wanted to I feel like I want to go there, see it, have my own like real life experience to hold on to, because everything is probably just outside for me. So I would definitely want to understand like what you're expressing right now. I've heard it from everybody, my cousins, everyone that goes home says it's just different. It's like a different vibe completely. So definitely feel like it's a neat experience for African immigrants and Black Americans here to just have that one trip and to learn more and to expand your worldview.
Yeah, expand your worldview and connect with your roots, right? And to be in a place where you are wanted and loved and seen. And I don't want to generalize and say that the entire continent, you know, is like that, or that you might experience that in the entire continent. But I know that there is this shared sort of understanding of who we are. Especially as the time evolves and as more people are beginning to see that, you know, we are one Black diaspora, and people need to be able to trace, you know, their lineage back to where they're from, which is ultimately that continent. And maybe what is one advice that you have for Black immigrants in this country?
Advice I would say is to definitely don't take any word or any type of opinion, I think, as factor as like the one overall viewpoint. I feel like you need to have multiple different sources with your own, besides, especially not from the media. You need to have your own independent outside opinion, not to kind of be persuaded to think one way or the other. I think that would be great advice, is to kind of like really seek out what you were taught to learn, what you thought was true, and to like do that unlearning process and to like re-educate yourself on like different things you didn't know, because through that process you would learn I guess a different sense of identity, greater sense of like how we're connected, and just like it would allow you to kind of process things differently. Who knows how you can kind of expand and get involved and to grow throughout life. So I think that's one thing I'll try to tell people, is to unlearn whatever you thought was true and to learn different experiences, especially now with social media. I think you can get like real life experiences for people back home about what it's like through like TikTok or through Instagram. So definitely do research and just get multiple sources.
I love that you mentioned TikTok because I don't understand that platform
Yes.
personally. Okay, like my daughter was trying to explain it to me. I'm like, 30 seconds, 60 seconds, I don't get it. But, you know, you're right. I think there's so many things that I could say about this that I think applies to all immigrants and not just Black immigrants. I think because we all share an experience here in this country as immigrants, and often we're conditioned in the same way because that's what white supremacy does. It tends to divide and sort of conquer and group communities. A few years ago, 2 years ago, actually, I'm on the board of One America, and we organized a rally following the murder of George Floyd at the height of the racial awakening in this country. And it was called Black Lives Matter, Black Immigrants and Refugee Solidarity Rally. And we had a number of people who represented different immigrant groups, folks from Vietnam and Somalia and Ethiopia and Eritrea and Mexico, and different immigrant populations were in that space, telling us about the ways in which white supremacy has socialized them to believe about Black people in particular, and the things that they've been taught and the ways that they've been unlearning that. Because like I said earlier, it's not just about the systems. It's not just about, some white people being racist. It's also about the immigrants who are taught to believe in these things through an education system that doesn't teach them differently, that doesn't teach them the actual history of what happened. And through, our own, right? We also have an obligation to learn and to go on social media, the TikToks or the Googles of the world and get accurate information, because there's so much information out there. And I realized, that although we all come from different parts of the world, that we share this experience of being immigrants in this country, and we believe and have been taught these things, and we're all on this journey of trying to unpack the ways in which we've been conditioned, and ultimately to do better, because our fates are interconnected. And when we all are doing better, we're all doing better.
Yes.
And so that would be one advice: unlearn the things that you've been taught and continue to do that work. I want to thank Rainier Avenue Radio for the opportunity to be in conversation.
Yes, thank you guys.
With Mulki Mohamad and the team for making this possible. We thank you for the opportunity and look forward to continued conversations.
Thank you so much.
Happy Black History Month every day.
Yes.
Am I early? Oh.
Still live?
Okay.